Forum Feb, they just start. It's gonna be like. You just said start. Okay. So I will start. I will use the microphone so people can hear. You all hear?
Yeah.
Okay. I also have a very loud voice, so, like you're in the theater and I'm my father's daughter, so. So I'm Erin Maye Quade. I use she, her pronouns. If you live in Apple Valley, most of Rosemount, or what I call the hill or the hat or the eastern part of Eden, I am your state senator. And I'm not going to talk for too long. I always say I think the longest people want to hear me speak for like most is 7 minutes. And then we can have a conversation. But we're going to talk today, or I'm going to talk today about how my faith and politics kind of intertwine. And I'm going to go back. So my dad's we were members since '83. I was born in '86. Okay, so I'm not born in '83. I'm born in '86. I'm 36 years old, but I've been going here my entire life. And I was confirmed here, ladies, I don't know if you're here, with my confirmation teachers. And I went to ECU, where I was the head of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. I actually lettered in FCA. I didn't know it was a thing you could do, but I was like that devoted. And when I was probably 11 or 12, so it was during Felicky's time with me, is when I really became very, very passionate about Christianity and our faith. And I would say the thing that I did the most from about the age of 12 to the age of 25 was church. I went to the University of St. Thomas. It was a Catholic university. My very first day of university, my very first class, the Christian Theological Tradition, Theology 101. Sitting in front row, it's like Monday morning, 8:15 a.m. The professor walks in, slams down his binder, and he goes, "Martin Luther broke the church." Me too. I called my mom, who was raised both Catholic and Lutheran. I was like, "Is there a difference between Catholics and Lutherans?" And she was like, "Yes." You're going to learn. And so at the University of St. Thomas, I joined the liturgical choir and the concert choir. So I would go to mass on Sundays, and then I would walk down the road to my Lutheran church. And so I would spend many hours a week at church. But I remember the very first time we did a mass, the liturgical choir, we sing right after the homily, which is basically the sermon for anybody who's not been to a Catholic mass. And I know that our song comes up right after the homily, and the priest ends his homily, and then I go to rise, and someone pushes my head to sit back down because they meet got in silence for several minutes after the homily. The very first time we had to do communion, I walked up because the table's been set for everybody, and I went and held out my hands, and someone went, "No." And I was like, "Hey, there's a different belief in Catholicism about communion and transubstantiation." I learned the hard way for a lot of these things. And then I would have the respite of walking down the street to Pilgrim Lutheran Church and sitting in the pews and knowing that the table was set for everyone and knowing that I wasn't going to mess it up and that there's not like an extra part to the Lord's Prayer that I didn't know and all these things. Then I started teaching, or I started helping at a church during Sunday night service in the nursery. And so the parents would come and they would drop off their babies. And so I would spend an hour listening to service and worship and watching these adorable little babies. And then I would go back and then I would go to church. So Sundays, I would spend 9 hours in church. It was my favorite thing to do. And it was right around college time. I was walking up to the campus on St. Thomas, and we would chalk the sidewalks about clubs on campus. And there was this woman's name everywhere, Allie, A-L-L-Y, Allie. And then one day I walked up to my friend, I said, "Allie, why does she have her own club?" And he said, "It's actually ally. LGBTQ people. But we are not allowed to say gay. So we can't write it out. So we just put ally." And I was furious. I was like, I didn't even know I was gay. I didn't know I was gay till like 25, but I was very, very mad. I had this lovely shirt that said straight but not narrow. I think I protested too much, but so that sparked this thing in me because I'm like, I'm at this university, it's a Catholic university, yes, but it is rooted in a Christian tradition. And I have spent my whole life just knowing like on fire for Jesus. The very first time I heard the story about Jesus turning water into wine, the fishes and loaves, this mindset of abundance versus scarcity, I was like, that is my guy. And we would go to church services and I would hear about the love and I would hear about the community that we were meant to create. And then you'd leave church and you would hear about the horrible things people would say about one another. And I was like, what were you listening to? And so I'm at St. Thomas and I'm like, what Bible are you reading? What stories are you hearing? And I would go to classes and I would have these social justice warrior nuns, like women who chain themselves to nuclear facilities. And these like, professors who had done these incredible things, marched with Dr. King and stood up for all of these things. I'm like, yes, this is the Christianity I know. But the Christianity that I was experiencing on campus was just horrible. Like less than a decade before that, there had been a cross that had been burned in the front yard of a Black student's home. And there have been racist incidents, and these continue at St. Thomas even until now, but I stopped wearing my cross when I was in college because I saw the picture. And I couldn't believe that something that was a testament of our faith was actually burned in the front yard of a student because he was Black. And so it was just experiencing all of these dichotomies in our faith that really helped me understand that I had really experienced Christianity as an expression of my politics before I ever knew that I had politics to express. And so I started doing something on campus. I created this group called Unite UST because I learned that it wasn't just the LGBTQ students on campus that weren't allowed to have a club. I learned that one of my classmates in one of my classes who used a wheelchair, he was late to class often because the buildings are very old at St. Thomas, and he would have to take the elevator up, and sometimes it wouldn't work, or sometimes it would be late, and so he would get a tardy in class, and his grade was docked. And I started riding the elevator with him to get the same dock because that was really unjust. And I started talking to some of the Black students on campus who are brought to campus a whole week earlier than most of the students on campus. It's very white campus. And so they meet each other and they're like put into groups and clubs. And then a week later, all the rest of the students come on campus and it's like overwhelming and white. And so then the Black students are accused of segregating themselves and not hanging out with other students. And they're like, well, we only know each other. You brought us here to campus to meet each other. Of course we're segregated to ourselves. And so we just created this huge, massive movement of bringing together people who are marginalized at the University of St. Thomas to want to ask for change. And that was what Unite UST was. And it was deeply rooted. I mean, it started with 3 people in my dorm room. And then like the next week, we had to move to the community room. And the next week we had to actually move to an auditorium because the more and more that people heard about, somebody wants to do something, people want to do something, people wanted to join. And so that was really the first time I started organizing before I really knew what organizing was. And it was bringing people together around a shared purpose of education. And so, there are still troubles at St. Thomas. We didn't fix it all. Lots of things live on after 4 years of people graduating. But it was during that time that I was like, this is what I've been preparing my whole life for. This is why I spend 9 hours every Sunday in church, is to learn the message of our faith and to act it out, to live it out in this community, to not just keep it in the church, not to keep it in the chapel, but to actually live it out in our community. I graduated from high school from ECU in 2004, and I graduated from St. Thomas in 2008. And in those 4 years, there was a really big conversation about marriage equality. And that was when I started getting pushed away from our faith. And it's hard because this is what I spent like my whole life. I wanted to be a pastor. When I went to St. Thomas, I wanted to be a pastor. I was going to go to graduate school, Union Theological Seminary, to be a pastor. And it was some of the conversations about LGBTQ people were so heartbreaking. To hear heart being used against people who wanted to love one another was really hard. And I stopped going to church. I just stopped. There was one day I went to a wedding and I was a bridesmaid, and my friend was getting married, and it was like 2009, and the pastor launched into this, the minister I should say, launched into this segment that was not planned, talk about how marriage is between one man and one woman. And it was probably 10 minutes of their marriage ceremony. And I'm watching my friend's face get redder, redder, redder. And she was like about to stop him. And I'm standing like 3 people down from her. My girlfriend is sitting in the audience. I'm like, what do I do? I'm just standing here, like taking this. And that was why I stopped going to church. That was the day. Because it felt like I could walk into any church and I could know, is it okay to be here? Is it not okay to be here? And then this church went through the reconciling Christ process. And that is what brought me back. And I can't tell you what it feels like to walk into these rooms and these halls, to be affirmed, how much it heals my heart, how much it carries me through the work that I do at the Capitol, which is mostly centered around feeding people, Jesus, which is mostly centered around giving people healthcare and housing and places to live and all of these things. It's really what drives me. And I was so disconnected from it for so long. What makes me a good leader now is to be brought back into that. And this church is why I have that. So didn't even get emotional, but it has been a really hard journey. And it really is what drives me now. And so just know that all of the work that I do at the legislature is rooted in what we believe and what we share. It doesn't mean that everybody in Minnesota has to be Lutheran or believe what we believe, but it's what drives me. It's what makes me want to do the things that we do. Knowing that we share this common purpose to love one another, and then to demonstrate that love, not just talk about it here and then leave and go do the opposite, to actually demonstrate that love is what drives a lot of my work. I'll tell you my favorite story that kind of centers all of the work that I do, and then we can just talk about whatever you want to talk about. But I remember I was hearing a sermon about the turn the other cheek, walk the extra mile, give a man your cloak. And I forget, Pastor Sarah, Matthew, what is it?
It's actually right after the passage I just read.
Okay, right. I remember thinking, look, what a yucky, like, someone hits you, turn the other cheek. If somebody asks you to walk a mile holding their gear, like, do it twice. If you're naked and all you have is your cloak, like somebody, and I heard this amazing sermon, and he was talking about how the context for this passage really, really matters, much like today's.
Yes.
And the context is that at the time, enslaved people could only be hit with the back of the hand. And so if you turned your cheek, you would be asking that person to hit you with the front of your hand and acknowledge you as an equal. At the time, enslaved people could only be asked to carry the armor of a soldier for 1 mile. And so the order was do it another mile, because they can't ask you to walk it back another mile. They'll have to walk that whole mile themselves. If you were naked, the one thing you were allowed to have was your cloak. If you're naked, if you are poor, and they're asking you for like the one thing that you have, give it all. Show them how awful this request is. And it was in that moment that I realized that Jesus was not submissive. He was subversive. He was not asking us to be docile people who never fought back against oppression. It was be creative and strategic and think about how you're going to fight back about that. Show people how deeply wrong these things are. And so that is really like that moment. I was like, oh, I found it. And this is what I'm going to do. And so, but as your state senator, just know that what drives me every day is the deep desire to root out injustice, because it is not for plan. It is not called down from on high that we have racism and sexism and homophobia and ableism. Like those are created by humans, which means we are uniquely qualified to solve those problems. And the systems that we create are started with our government. And so that is what the work that I do is really rooted in, making sure that we use those systems to actually live out what we're called to do, which is love and support one another. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for coming. I hope this is the start of a wonderful conversation. You can ask me anything you want to, but I'd love to talk to you more. Go ahead and tell me your name too.
I'm Kathy Peregrino. And thank you. This is, I'd really like to record what you said earlier about, the turning the other cheek, and that was just fascinating. But my question for you is, these last 4 years or 6 years now, have been so difficult. What keeps you going when things get really, really tough on the Hill?
The question was, for anyone who might not have heard it, these last number of years have been really tough and what keeps me going. Therapy. Exercise. Disengaging, because there's problems that I can know about to do something with other people, and then there's things that I can focus on that I'm not solving, but it feels like if I'm not paying attention, then no one's doing anything, but just paying attention actually is, it's like admiring the problem, not fixing the problem. So knowing when I can fix something and knowing when knowing about it is enough. And then like having a really good community. I think one of the things that's happened in the last, 6 years is kind of the timeline you gave, is that for some people, it was a light got shine on problems that they've already been experiencing. And for some people, it was the first time they were seeing because the light was shining on it. And it was really overwhelming. And so I think the ask of ourselves always has to be, like, we can't give everything we have to fixing injustice and nothing to ourselves. Because if we're not alive, if we're burnt out, like we can't help, right? And so I think of it as kind of like rowing in a boat, right? If someone gets tired, we're not like, hey, you gotta keep going. It's like, okay, we can take over, right? And so we gotta trust that people are plugged in the right places and taken care. Like I am deeply, deeply passionate about making sure that people can get to and from work, east and west in the suburbs, but I'm not a transportation expert, but I trust my folks in transit equity that they're doing that work and that they can tell me how I plug in instead of being like, I have to know everything over here, right? So it's knowing like, what am I in? What's my lane? How can I create opportunities for people to get plugged in? How can I say yes when I can and no when I can't? And then the things that we know that keep us alive, like water and sunlight and human connection and snuggling. And I have a baby who's amazing and I have a family who's amazing. So all of those things. I hope that it's not like groundbreaking. It's just like basic here.
Thank you.
Well, she brought up a point about the focus of government, and it doesn't seem like they can focus. Priorities. When you sit back and you don't do anything like me, but you listen and you say, well, what are the priorities? Why can't we? I know there's a lot going on, but why can't we just work together on major issues? Clean up, if you clean up one, I mean, I want to use immigration as an example, because it affects Minnesota. And, I don't understand the problem, actually, if you put money to it, but you have to limit so that you can take care of the people. Isn't that what everybody wants? I mean, they don't want, there's a lot of people who want immigrants. We just don't like them in that they can't be taken care of because of the problems that are created that demand more money and more meanness strikes home in the hearts of people who are frustrated with why isn't this working. I just think about, I just don't understand that. Immigration has been there for years. The laws are dumb. And they can't fix that. I mean, there has to be a compromise. There has to be. I don't understand that. At least a step forward.
And tell me your name.
I'm Marilyn.
Marilyn.
I live in Eden.
So the question was about priorities and like focusing on big problems and using immigration as an example.
Well, there's
And
others
there's
that
many.
you know
Yeah,
more about.
everybody's
priorities.
Yeah, and he said everybody's priorities are different.
Yes.
I think one of the, so, immigration is a little bit, because it's a federal issue and not a state issue, there are things we can do at the state level to make sure that we welcome and care for people who come to our state. But, the laws around immigration aren't state-based, which is unfortunate. We could probably fix some things in Minnesota, at least. I don't know if I'm on other states handling. Anyway. So I think it's important to know that there are a lot of crises that happen all at the same time, right? And I experience this every day where I'll be going about my day thinking about this one crisis, and then someone will come and talk to me and they will show me, a statistic. So Alzheimer's is one that actually just like rose to I just have a bill up for it on Monday, so that's why I'm gonna bring this up. It is not like a looming crisis, it is here. We have more people, they call it the silver tsunami, apologies to anyone with silver hair, but we have more people who are aging than are being born or the younger years, and people are having dementia and Alzheimer's at higher rates. Black Minnesotans are 2 times as likely to have Alzheimer's and dementia. Latino Minnesotans are 1.5 times as likely. This is statistics for Indigenous Minnesotans. So my rule is if it's bad for Black Minnesotans, it's worse for Indigenous Minnesotans. That's always the rule. But for Indigenous Minnesotans, I think it's like 2.7 or 3 times as high, right? So it's also a racial justice issue. And part of it is getting people's attention, right? It's getting the right people's attention because this is a priority for me now. And it's a priority for the chair of the HHS committee, which is hearing my bill. But after it's heard in committee, is it enough of a priority for the entire caucus to vote on it? Do we have time? Is it enough of a priority to make sure? Because we can only be in session for 180 days every 2 years. That's the Constitution, the Constitution says that. And so it's getting buy-in, right? Because the democracy works where we have all of these elected representatives. And so it's getting buy-in from everybody else to say, this has to be a priority among all the other priorities. But maybe for someone like Senator Bobby Joe Champion, who has what they call the HERC, it's a garbage burner, and it blows all of the air into North Minneapolis. And the rates of asthma and cancer are nuts, right? And so for Bobby Joe Champion, maybe that's like a top priority, right? And so I think what it is that part of being an elected official is knowing your community enough to know like where your priorities are.
Well, can't you vote on it? Can't the public vote? Can't there be lists of ranking and saying, okay, we have a representative, I want, the majority of people want you to work on this. I mean, obviously, you're gonna have a mix, and
Yeah.
you could also take from spending priorities and also health priorities. I mean, you can categorize. I mean, there's ways to get better organized than we are now.
I think you're bringing up one of the most interesting parts of being an elected official and having a democracy is that, you know, when people run, they put forward kind of their priorities. And so when people vote, we see that as, okay, a majority of people in my district said, yes, these are good priorities. But like, I'll do something where I'll send out a survey and I'll list maybe 7, but I'll leave a space for people to write stuff in. What I have found most often is that people do have broadly the same values. One of the things I heard when I knocked doors, there's knocked like 10,000 doors personally, 6 weeks after I had a baby, which was, I don't recommend. I started, and what I heard a lot from people is, I just want people to have their basic needs met. I want to make sure that people have a safe place to live and nourishing food and good schools, and you know, that I heard that a lot. And how that turns into policy is a little bit more complex. And so I think you know, we see the voting and electing elected officials as kind of setting forward those priorities. And we do a lot of engagement work. We do town halls and surveys of our constituents to make sure. There's the survey at the state fair every year. I encourage everyone to go fill that out because that gets brought up a lot at the legislature, weirdly, but I think it's good because, you know, a lot of people go to the state fair. And then getting engaged with your elected officials if there is a priority that you have, because we don't read minds. We're just a part-time legislature. Like, I'm an advocate at the outside of the legislature. I work in legal and policy nonprofit work. And so you all in this room could be like, I know what the #1 priority is, and you could all agree. But if none of you tell me, I might not know. And so engaging with your elected officials, even if you think they agree with you, especially if you think they agree with you, is actually really important. Because oftentimes we only hear from people who disagree with us. This makes it really difficult to know where our folks are. A question back there.
Social Security in Minnesota.
Yeah,
I just moved here and they're taxing my Social Security.
yeah.
I know what's gonna happen.
That's a great question. Tell me your name.
Doris.
Doris, welcome. We're glad you're here. Minnesota is one of the few states that taxes Social Security. It is, there are 10 bills in the Senate to remove the tax on Social Security. One of them is moving. I think the biggest, from a policy standpoint, is making sure that we have a budget responsibility to make sure that we don't blow a hole in our budget and have to cut programs somewhere else. So making sure that we are budgeting responsibly is the most important part of that, but there is a bill moving and I'm on the bill. I'm one of the co-authors on the bill. So there's broad bipartisan support for doing it. I think just making sure that it's done responsibly is probably the path right now.
Thank you.
My name is Stasha. In your intro, when you talked about attending a Catholic service and trying to take communion for the first time and being told no. I had a really similar experience the first time I went to a Catholic church. I grew up Lutheran and thought, I'll just go take communion, and then find out I wasn't allowed to. And then later on in life, I went to a different synod of Lutheranism. I think it was Wisconsin. And found out
Yeah.
and it just felt like I could never be part of the group. And that's been part of like my journey to come here, is feeling like I belong here.
Yeah.
And I guess where I'm going with this is, some people, some communities have more of an in-group versus out-group attitude, versus a broader, like, everybody's part of one group, we just have different viewpoints. So when you're collaborating with people from other districts or other, people on the hill, how do you handle it when you are interacting with someone who has a strong in-group versus out-group mentality?
The question was about how do I collaborate with people who have a strong sense of in-group versus out-group. And so like, let's be really candid. I am a young, queer, Black woman who's part of the Senate, where the average age is like 65. And I was the first Black woman ever elected to the Minnesota State Senate, ever, in our entire state. Every senator who's there has never had to sit at a table with a Black woman and make a policy. And never a Black mom. I'm the first Black mom ever elected to the Minnesota State Senate, right? So the sense of in-group like might not even be conscious. It might just be like, I've literally never been, and I have to take a lot of stuff because my constituency didn't send me there. You didn't send me there to take things personally and then not work with people because I was offended. It happens the first time I got called a racial slur at the Minnesota legislature was my first day of that. And I still like that person who did it. We are on bills together and we still work together because I think that's important is finding ways that you can build relationships, finding ways that you can see the humanity in each other, and then slowly teaching people along the way. Yes, there are people who see in-group versus out-group, and I compartmentalize. Like, people will stand up on the floor and say horrible things about people who look like me, people who are married like me, people who, all these things. And I'm just like, literally, I wipe myself off. Like, I physically wipe myself off. I'm like, that lives there, and it's a new day for policy. And so that's kind of how I handle it. That's not true for every legislator. Some people are like, I can't even, and that's okay. But I find that most of my bills are bipartisan. Part of what makes me an effective legislator is to be able to like take that and know that I'm allowed to be upset. I'm allowed to be offended, but I'm not really allowed to like disengage because that doesn't help any of the people in my district who sent me there to get something done. So that's kind of how I think.
This might be a loaded question, but from an idea that someone brings to you to the voting on it, what are the steps?
Okay. What are the steps from an idea to voting on it? Okay. So the first, like someone brings me an idea. I always use this as an example. It's mostly something I use for students, but it's actually really easy. All day or all year-round school, right? Summer break is actually really hard. We have a lot of learning loss. It was for a different time for different reasons. So year-round school. Let's say that was the idea someone brought to me. The first thing I would do is I would engage with, we have both partisan research and nonpartisan research. And the reason we have that is because nonpartisan research, and they're like lawyers, they are the ones that if I went to them and I said, I need to write a bill that makes year-round school, they're the ones who find the statute and write the language that would make it so, right? You can't just write a bill that says we have school year round. Like you have to go in and find out like what sets the parameters are on the school year, what sets the parameters around like the second Sunday of, the school time off, all of those things. So they would find all of those statutes and they would amend it. And then they would bring it back to me and they would say, does this look right? And I would look through it and we'd have some revisions back and forth. Then I would engage with stakeholders. So I would talk to Education Minnesota, who is our teachers union. I would talk to the Minnesota Association of School Boards and of school administrators and the principals and the districts, because this affects them, right? Year-round school affects them. I would probably have some town halls with some students and some childcare providers and summer camps, because I want to make sure, like, are we in for this? And do we need to change anything to make sure folks are in? And then there'd be lots of revisions. I'd be taking a lot of notes and I would be, going through. Then I would talk to the chair of the education committee, both policy and finance, because there's policy implications and then there's financial implications. And I would say, do you support this? What questions do you have? Do you know of any groups that are working on this? Do you know anybody that this is important to? And then, so this, we're talking like years. This is like 1 to 2 years. Then you want to start building a coalition. And so a coalition would involve the most passionate stakeholders, hopefully people who are for it, and then maybe there's a coalition against it. Sometimes that happens too. And then you want to lobby for a hearing. And when you set up your hearing, you want to make sure people come and they testify to say like, this is important to us and this is why. Here's the, professor who's saying, I'm an educator and I can tell you that this amount of learning loss happens, but in states where they have year-round school, this is how much doesn't happen. And here is the economic benefit. And here's the, whole person benefit. Here's the community benefit, whatever that may be. And then from committee, you either have to whip it. So you talk to all of your colleagues, would you support this? Would you support this? Would you support this? And you got to get to 50 plus 1, 50% plus 1, so majority. And then you got to lobby the majority leader to hear it on the Senate floor. And then you hear it on the floor and then you vote on it. And then you got to do that whole process in the House. And so that whole process has to happen in the other chamber. And both bills, when they get introduced, they're identical, but then there's a processes to amend it, right? In committee, the first committee, then there's a process to amend it in the second committee, and then you can amend things on the Senate floor. And that all happens in the House too. So if your bill comes out different in the Senate than it does in the House, then you have to have a conference committee where you figure out, okay, what's the final language going to be. And you got to make sure you talk to the government and the Department of Education, the Commissioner of Education, that they're on board because the governor has to sign it. And it doesn't fit into his budget or her budget, hopefully one day. And then once all that happens and it's passed through the House and it's passed through the Senate, and then you have a conference committee, you figure out the final language, and then you send it back to both bodies for an up or down vote, and then it's engrossed by the engrosser, and it's signed by the president of the Senate, and it's signed by the Speaker of the House, and it's signed by the governor. It's law, so it's crazy.
Better you than us.
Anybody could ask anything, so he has a very question. He wants to know if you're gonna watch the game this Saturday. Who are you rooting for? Don't look at me. I don't care. The red team.
I'm Diana.
Yeah.
And I was, just asking a question, the, state looks a little bit different than it did 100 years ago when, all of these rules were put in place about session time and frequency and things like that.
Yeah.
Are there serious discussions going on about making, maybe not a full-time Senate, but at least meeting every year rather than every 2 years?
That's a great question. So we do meet every year. We are only allowed to meet for 180 days within those 2 years. So we work on a biennium. There are conversations, they're very low level at this point about being a full-time legislature. We're a part-time legislature. We started in January of the odd year, so after this year, it's the budget year, and we end May 22nd of this year. So in the Constitution, it's like the third Monday after the third Sunday. I don't know, it's really complicated, but May 22nd of this year. And then the second year is a little bit shorter. It's our bonding year. The bonding is essentially borrowing, and it's where we do like massive infrastructure projects, our roads, our bridges, our hospitals, our schools, those kinds of things. The reason why there are conversations around a full-time legislature or maybe just meeting for longer is that we have full-time problems. And I think about if COVID had started instead of in March 2020 when we were in session, if it had started in September of 2020, the governor would have had to call a special session. But the legislature that they would have had to agree to meet and have plans, it's complicated. And so I am supportive of it in theory. Here's where it gets a little tricky. If you have a full-time legislature, it becomes a much more professionalized and high profile position. It costs more money to run, which keeps more people out. I don't want to see more ads on TV, so it is a little bit weird in that way. And then we have to change the Minnesota Constitution, and that would be up to the voters. So the legislature could pass a constitutional amendment, put it on the ballot, but then voters would have to approve it. And if they did it, then there's really not. So it would have, I would say, a commission or a task force to probably look at it and give some recommendations on, is this a good idea? Would it solve the problems? What might problems would it create? Because I think experts are always good to see some of those things. I'm gonna go Marge and then.
Yeah, hi Marge.
I have a question back to the year-round school.
Yeah,
If that issue comes to yourself or another legislator and we have a personal bias one way or the other, how does that, I mean, it shouldn't affect it, but does it in some cases where someone would push more for something that they're for versus something, you know, to kind of
Yeah.
lay back a little bit on something that they're not really in favor? Because you really gotta you gotta kind of push it, if you're gonna do all those steps.
yes, yes, so the question was, you know, does your personal opinion about the issue impact on how much you push for it? And the answer is yes, so I'll give you a really good example. There was a gentleman who came to my town hall last weekend who said that we should have programs in school to teach kids how to use guns. I don't agree with that. And so if he brought me that proposal, I probably wouldn't be a very good person to help him create the coalition around it to move the policy.
Amen.
Yeah. I mean, he was talking about his 4-year-old using guns. So, that's probably not a good policy. But you know what? He's also a constituent. He has a right to have that opinion, and if he wants to build policy and coalition around that, he absolutely should. I would probably be in a coalition against it, but I
Would
would.
you refer them to another?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a number of legislators I think that would be very interested in that too.
So, Senator, my name's Will.
Representative Will Morgan.
Former life. So, Senator, you mentioned at the beginning that some of the people who are in this room, you're their senator. They live in Apple Valley, close to Rosemont and so forth. Could you maybe give some folks some advice who you're not there, if you're not their senator? How can they find out who their senator and representative is? And B, for everybody, this is not an official meeting you're holding right now. If somebody wanted to have an official meeting with you or their senator or representative, what would be a good way to go about that?
Great question. So, the first thing I'll tell you is, that you can and should email your legislators about things that are important to you. If you see something on the news, the legislature is considering blah, 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 and you're like, yay, you should email them. Or no, you should email them. But also if you don't see that, if there's something that, like, I have a lot of folks at the doors who are really passionate about recycling. I want to see recycling increased in our city and in our county. Not necessarily a state issue, but there are things that the state could do to make it easier for those programs to be extended. That I have never gotten an email about it, but I talked to like 40 people at the doors, so that was like one of their top issues. So people you don't email folks about something that's important to you, they will literally never. The second, you can Google who represents me MN, and it will take you to the website where you put in your address, and it will tell you your senator, United States Senator, your US member of Congress, your state senator, your state representative, and I think it will tell you your county commissioner as well, which is a layer of government I don't want anybody to forget about. We have county commissioners, they do a lot of really important work in our county. We have town halls, I have town halls, you can sign up for my official side newsletter, and I will announce those. But you can, you can email, you can come, so if you're part of a coalition group, AARP, or you're an optometrist, or you're a teacher, or I mean, most professional organizations have some sort of good capital. Make sure you find out what that is and go, because then you can talk to your elected representatives about issues that are important to a coalition group that you're part of. Did I miss anything, Will? I mean, you've been there.
How many senators are in District 2?
In Congressional District 2?
Yeah.
How many senators are in Congressional District 2? Okay, there are 67 state senators. And in CD2, there's me, Lindsay Port, Jim Carlson, Matt Klein, okay, Duckworth.
So you mentioned Apple Valley and Rosemont.
Yes.
What about Farmington?
Farmington is Senator Duckworth. And another part of Farmington might be another new one too. They redistricted recently.
What was the Google? What do you?
If you Google who represents me, MN, it'll be there. Yes,
Okay, I'm Ginny, and I kind of have 2 questions, so, and they kind of go together. So you say email them, whatever. So I did email my state representative recently because I heard something was happening in another state, and I wanted to say, I don't want this to happen here. So what's going on with that? And she responded and said, thank you. We'll look into this, and I had never heard back. So like, what's the follow-up recommendation for if you do contact them?
Yep.
And then my second part of this is I came to your, you had a town hall.
Yeah.
I've been here once before with the, afterwards of the earth kind of thing, and kind of people will go, this is pre-COVID, whatever. Which I did, I went and met with state representative at that time too, thank you for all your work on that. How did that shake out?
It shook out well. We have a 100% clean energy bill, which was passed in Senate as well. And follow back up, because a lot of times, we have legislative assistants who, they put things into a database and say, like, you have a constituent that emailed you about this. And I, like, speaking from personal experience, sometimes I'll get an email. I got an email from a doctor that was like, here are some issues I want you to know about in children who play youth sports. And I was like, this is fascinating, thank you. And so I was home reading about it. I actually haven't emailed that doctor back, and she didn't really put at the end, like, and then let's talk about it, but this is a good place for me to do that. So if she reached back out, that was like, do you want to meet about it? I'd be like, yes. And so if you just follow back up and say, hey, did you read about it? What do you think? You'll probably get a response again. Thank you. Other questions? Burning question. Yeah.
Simple question, Dick Iger's name, what's happening with the billions of surplus that are laying around in hazardous lots?
I am so excited to talk about my very favorite thing, which is the budget surplus. I'm gonna put it in quotes. Here's why. $11.6 billion of the $17.6 billion surplus is one-time money from the federal government. There was an agreement at the end of last session before this new legislature was elected to spend that money, and then folks kind of walked away from it. So it's just been being held, and it was to the states to address things like health care and education and all of those things, because a lot of states don't budget quite as responsibly as the state of Minnesota. And because we do, it wasn't urgent that it get out the door. We were funding, our social security programs, and we were funding like disability services and healthcare and all those things. So 11.6, which is like 65% of the budget surplus, is one-time money that we can never count on for ongoing structural things. Like we couldn't make a new program and count on that money to support it. Additionally, in 2003, the legislature removed inflation from budget estimates, so that if you wanted to fund schools at the exact same level 2 years from now, it'll cost more money then than it does now, right? And so like anywhere from 1.3 to 3.4 are the estimates I've heard of how much of the $6 billion that's remaining of that surplus is just would be eaten up by inflation just to keep things the same. So it leaves us with like $2 to $3 billion of budget surplus. So that's where I would put our actual budget surplus at. And we'll get a February forecast very soon. That'll be a little bit more accurate. And that's what our budget will be off of. So from there, then the questions are, what ongoing spending do you want to create? Knowing that part of the reason we have that $2 to $3 to $4 billion surplus is because there was a lot of economic activity during the pandemic. So yes, people were paying sales tax, but it's economic activity that I don't know we can always count on, right? Like people were at home, we were buying new furniture, we were buying new cars, we were buying new cell phones, we were doing our patios, we were doing a lot of stuff that is probably going to cool down. And so my caution has always been not saying 17.6, because it gives the illusion that we tax people like way more than we should in the state of Minnesota to fund things that we are already funding, and then we could do a whole bunch more when we can't. I would say we're probably dang near close to even. And so any budgetary commitments that we're making have to be incredibly responsible, not just for the next 2 years, but for ongoing, so that in like 4 years, we don't find ourselves being like, gee, which disability programs do we have to cut? Gee, are we gonna get rid of universal school meals? Like all of those things. So that's kind of that's where I'm at on the budget. Did that all make sense? Does that math make sense?
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Oh, no, I was just mindful
People
of
here
time,
with money.
so I was thinking maybe if there's one more question, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up.
Brad, did you say you had a question?
No, but I do. Yeah. I was just thinking, we're gonna be a energy neutral state. And I can't seem to see how we're gonna do it without nuclear power. And what's your opinion on that?
That's a good question. The answer is nuclear is part of the 100% clean energy.
We have a blockage. I'm thinking of
A moratorium.
a moratorium on new nuclear plants. Yeah.
Yeah, part of the reason why we have that moratorium, and I think it's a good idea, is because when we pay our utility bills, a lot of us, especially now, as we have more wind and solar and hydro and all of these things, and, you know, possibly small cell nuclear or hydrogen, which is like a really cool clean energy thing that's coming. We are not paying for like natural gas or coal. We're actually paying for the infrastructure that was built to get us that electricity or to get us that energy. And so if we built a new nuclear plant, we would not see our rates go down. They would go way up, and they would stay up because no matter how much energy we're getting from other places, we still have to pay for the infrastructure of building that new nuclear facility. And so in a number of states that do have moratoriums and states that don't, in particular the states that don't, they have abandoned building nuclear facilities after like $9 billion. Like, they're very expensive to build. And then you would see that get passed on to ratepayers. And so I think the moratorium is a good idea. We do have nuclear facilities in Minnesota that are unlikely. Yes, Monticello and Prairie Island. The one thing I will say about the way we have nuclear in Minnesota right now is a huge racial injustice issue. We store nuclear dry casks 700 yards from the Prairie Island Indigenous community. Now, raise your hand if you want nuclear dry casks in your backyard. No, I think so. Nobody does, right? And so if we built another nuclear facility, we have to put all the nuclear waste somewhere else. And I just don't see any community being like, yeah, go ahead, throw them in our backyard. And we would probably do it to another indigenous.
So are we gonna make it with wind and solar?
Yes, and the good news is that the energy companies, like, I think Excel, for example, they're gonna get there way faster than 2040. I think they're gonna get there in like 2030. This is where it was headed anyway. I would be honest and say that, like, part of the way that we got to this bill, which was my bill in the House, I'm really excited that it like went where it did. Is that it took hundreds of hours of negotiations and stakeholders with power companies at the table, whether they were munis or co-ops or, you know, the big ones, to say, like, does this work? Are we going to be okay? And they have an offering too. If they're not going to hit 100%, they can go to the PUC and be like, hey, we're not going to hit that. Can we have an, you know, extended time period? So it is a very compromise bill that will get us to 100% clean energy. Probably not as fast as the planet needs it, but Minnesota itself cannot solve the climate crisis. So it's good enough.
Thanks.
Can we just thank Erin?